You told me I had to
Wow.
be dancing this time when we came on live, you know?
It absolutely had to be done. Wow, what an opening for a penultimate episode. This also gonna like sound absolutely ridiculous on an audio, right?
True.
It just opens up with ridiculous laughter. And that was fantastic for those of you who've missed Jason's amazing shoulder dance, I would call
Yeah,
it, which is surely a type of dance that we've never experienced before. Um, this was remarkable. So,
you're
so
welcome.
thank you for that. And with that, well, welcome back to the final live stream of season 7. We still have one more episode to come, and that will be a wrap up episode, but that will be just an audio. And that will also be an audience participation episode, so very exciting. But yeah, we're coming to the end of these discussions about the books and of reading together, which has been really exciting, really fascinating. And tomorrow is, of course, the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, 30th of October. And so it's great to be able to kind of to stretch the normal agenda, right, of the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction and talk about things that we don't necessarily discuss in disaster space, like books about Marxism and feminism and wage and patriarchy.
For sure. It's been amazing talking about the book so far this season, especially getting into like where they cross over into disaster work, how we can apply them. Hopefully it's made people think, like it has for me, about ways that I can stretch my own understandings of different concepts by reading things that I might not otherwise have thought like linked to my field. And as anyone who listens knows, that's kind of something that we love to do. So far in this season, we discussed a couple of books that were chosen by the audience in polls on Twitter that many of you probably participated in. We discussed in the last few weeks or months, Malcolm Ferdinand's Decolonial Ecology, Max Laboran's Pollution is Colonialism, and Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of Indignation. And thank you all for joining us in those sessions. If you missed them, the recordings are on YouTube and will be released as audio episodes as well. And so today we are discussing the final choice that our Twitter audience made for us, and that is Silvia Federici's Patriarchy of the Wage.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the original idea was to read Caliban and the Witch, and that's where kind of our obsession, right, just the Witch started from. But then I went to a bookstore and saw this other book and kind of persuaded everybody to put that on the poll, and there we are. And thank you everyone for voting for it. Today we're actually we will talk about the book, of course, but we actually want to stretch this conversation a little bit broader than we would normally do, because we really want to kind of explore how patriarchism connects to wage and economic struggle, and we will do it with our guest who will join us in just a few minutes. And today we will be joined by Dr. Maha Shuyap. And Maha is a British Academy bilateral chair in conflict and the director of Center for Lebanese Studies at the University of Cambridge. Maha is a sociologist and of education, in particular investigated education inequalities and the politics of education reform. And so this will be absolutely fascinating to bring Maha's insights into conflict and kind of struggle into, again, the conversations that we should really be having, but we are not. And I think it links really nicely with Federice's overarching message of kind of unimaginative revolution and lack of progress, therefore. And now the moment Camilo is waiting for every 2 weeks, the anticipation is killing him. Right? So Camilo, tell us, introduce the book and tell us what you thought.
Oh, excellent. Hi. Sorry, there is a bit of a noise because I'm one of those traveler now, so I'm stuck in somewhere. However, very quickly, the book is one of those books that you would never pick up on a shelf unless you are deliberately thinking about Marxism, feminism. And I think it's an interesting book for two reasons. One is has been written on the on the 150th anniversary of the writing of the Marx Capital, and to a certain extent combine different tone, if you want, or styles of writing of the chapter of Silvia Federici, which is a Marxist scholar. And being a Marxist scholar, of course, the question that the book is immediately posing is in relation to, and that interests us, is the fact that Marxism critique is one of the production of subjective ways work remain a very fundamental framework through which exercise a form of critical a method which both crisis.
Oh no, Camilo, we're losing you. The network keeps dropping.
And
Camilo, can you hear us? We keep losing.
Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe I can come to you,
Okay.
Jason, and then we'll see if Camilo's network comes back to live, and we can go back to Camilo again.
Yeah, unfortunately, the connection is really bad.
Can you?
No, we've lost you, Camilo. So let's go to Jason and see if we can reconnect you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed Caliban and the Witch, as you know, and we've talked about it on the podcast before. And so there was a lot of things in Patriarchy of the Wage that reinforce some of the things that I, understood as I read Caliban and the Witch, that were really kind of new for me. This book, I felt, went much more into a critique of Marxism and how, and started to unpack, like, well, how would Marx have grappled with some of these critiques if he were alive today. And I like how it kind of posed that question and speculated that maybe Marx would appreciate the ways his ideas have been shaped by critiques of from a colonial or post-colonial perspective, from a indigenous perspective, from a feminist perspective, and like the book kind of speculated that he would be down with that, were he around today. And but in particular, the book went into the change in the 19th century and the change in the role of women, and maybe spoke to why Marxism was a bit blind to that, blind to feminist ideas, and in particular the role of the working class women, like coming out of factories as something kind of intentional by capital to like for their own interest, for reproduction of bodies, and also to service men in different ways rather than having labor power. And I thought that just made me think a lot as to how that has shaped like our current family structure and the current way that we, like, the current inequalities that women experience in terms of their labor power now, because it's been fundamentally shaped by those historical processes, and of course we still live in an absolute patriarchy, which is informed by those processes. So yeah, for me, the underlying thing was just the critique of labor in some ways, the critique of labor struggles as often being kind of white and white, like a struggle for the white working class man,
for sure,
and not inclusive. And so I struggle a little bit to, like, both in Caliban and the Witch, although it's super super intriguing and opened my eyes to lots of things. I sometimes find like how to connect this kind of dense theory with my work. So yeah, that's what I kind of took away and what I'm grappling with in reading this book.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I found the book really intense, right? Not in the way that it's written, but it in its content, and really quite provocative. And I guess Caliban and the Witch was very similar in that sense. But I was really curious about this book because I absolutely love the quarrelsome tone that Federici used in Caliban and the Witch, right? And kind of in the way that she writes. And because I find it really exciting how Federici brings Marxism and feminism together, right? Not mixing them, but really sort of juxtaposes them and asks a really pertinent question that you alluded to, right? Why was Marx unable to anticipate these profound transformations in the proletariat family that took place in the 19th century, right? Instead, creating pretty much a new patriarchal regime. And her demonstration of that in Soviet Union, for instance, and in China, really quite profound. What I found, however, surprising is that instead of kind of completely dismissing Marxism altogether, right, her feminist critique modifies Marxist theory, and to make it kind of more exclusive for all revolutionary subjects, right? And as you said, it's not just about the white male industrial workers. And I kind of feel that these essays in the Patriarchy of the Wage books, because they're not really connected, right? They're just separate essays that span for 30 years of her work, perhaps more. They highlight the very unimaginative nature of revolution, be that the industrial revolution or the sexual revolution, because we still end up with capitalist patriarchalism, as she calls it, right? And she writes, we have always belonged to capital every moment of our lives, and it is time that we make capital pay for every moment of it. And it's wonderful kind of how masterfully, right, she shows how the capitalist strategy to divide and reorganize the working class really works. And she eloquently calls it patriarchy of the wage. And I found one of her flyers when I was kind of, I wanted to learn a little bit more about her when she was in New York in the 1970s, and she was kind of leading this campaign called No More Work for Free. And then one of her flyers, she wrote, "We are seen as nagging bitches, not workers in struggle." And I thought that just captures the division, right, of workers so well, and the division that wage provides the foundation for. And so these essays, they also really made me think about the way that we talk about vulnerabilities and capacities and disasters, right? And kind of when we talk, for example, about mutual support, because mutual support is sort of seen as this natural act of love and care, right? I'm just gonna go and support you, and that's just fine, right? And Federici so argues that this narrative actually serves the owning class, the powerful class, by separating, reproductive labor or labor of love or labor of care from the waged labor, when in fact both are necessary, right, to profit generation. And the central argument that true solidarity requires value in all labor, including love and care and reproduction, resonates with what I think we see in marginalized communities. But Marxism aside, kind of feminism aside, well, not really. I actually really enjoyed the final essay of this book on the origins and development of sexual work and the sexual liberation. And I just want to read very quickly this last paragraph. It's the last paragraph of the last essay. And she writes, "But the main difference is that our mothers and grandmothers looked at sexual services within a logic of exchange. You went to bed with the man you married, that is the man who promised you a certain financial security. Today, instead, we work for free, in bed and in the kitchen, not only because sexual work is unpaid, but because increasingly we provide sexual services without expecting anything in return. Indeed, the symbol of the liberated woman is the woman who is always available, but in return no longer asks for anything." And as I was reading this essay, I kept thinking about Marilyn French's work a lot, and it's kind of the same era, I guess, as that second wave of feminism, and her novel, The Women's Room, as well as, her nonfiction piece, Beyond Power, which we spoke so much about. And I could see such strong parallels with liberation in disaster, if you wish, right? In a sense that resilience has kind of become this really mainstreamed and apolitical tool for liberation, right? And as the number of women killed by their partners is growing, right? So is the number of people affected by disasters. But it feels that if we acknowledge this, if we really start talking about this, if we say that we do not believe in resilience, like we say we don't believe in sexual liberation, right? We will be seen as kind of backward, right? As really stymieing the argument. And so I think, to me, what this essay is called for is kind of that praxis of love that would really help us rediscover what love is. And perhaps we're going back to Freire here, and who kind of argued the same thing, right? And if we start considering disasters from this angle of love, where would we end up in our action? It's very interesting for me. And I do think that disaster scholars should read this book, because it's such fantastic insight into the history of feminist movement. And I think it's critical for the politics of today, because it really reflects, it should be reflected in our discussions around vulnerability, and it provides a basis for kind of articulation of a politics which would be aware of multiple facets of capitalist exploitation and struggle, right? Something that we're really trying to push forward. Camilo, you're back. So
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Sorry, I missed. I think you're absolutely right. It's one of those books that you would never, choose to pick it up unless you are very interesting, but everybody should read. And the reason for is specifically about the fact that offer a very fundamental original critique on production, which I think is super important, but also offer a sort of poetic intersectionality of the way in which the work of love and what you call it, and I found it interesting, the counter planning that happens in the kitchen, which is both something about the poetics of the everyday life, but also the way in which the struggle of reproduction. And we often think about production, but not reproduction, which is an often important element of overlook. So I think the book is on one side calling for an original critique, but on the other offering a unique version of a reflection on the productivity, specifically on the wage, into that. So I think it's very interesting to as an overlap. It's also very easy to read, which I found it interesting in compared to other forms of critical Marxist theory or other, is also very engaging. And the essay, which is the last that you already mentioned, is also very historically grounded, which I do believe is still in the spirit and in the style of Silvia Federici. So she goes very much into historical moment of struggles of wage and work and the construction of subjectivity, but also she is capable and able to convey very visible, very tangible, very poetic forms of reflection. That is very historically constructed, but is very much in relation to the working dimension. And today, I think this idea of production and working is very topical. Is working towards the everyday, is working towards the emotion, is working towards the ambient, is working towards the planning. And I do believe is a reconnection. There are aspects of the book that might be sort of interesting to provoke. For example, that is the chapters on when he speaks about the feminism and the construction of the common, which I think is especially in Europe, the notion of common and commonality and communism to a certain extent is quite a fundamental component. And maybe there is a more specific reflection on the different traditions of that. She questioned the original Antonio Negri and Michael Arendt reflection on the common, which comes from a very specific Eurocentric visions of what we saw in other books, the necessity to move to other forms of epistemology that question that, being together into, which I do believe is problematic on one side, but is still very, very interesting. So I believe the issue on productivity to me is super central, and also in the one on reproduction opens with a very interesting reflection across the different elements. There is probably a terminology we might need to question, which is the one of the proletariat, which is historically constructed in the way she works. But the question on who constitute the proletariat today. And you use the word marginalization and marginal, which I think is very interesting. And I think is also she does something around the notion of opacity and the transparency. So where we situate our research in terms of what we look, what are the objects of research, specifically in relation to disasters and crises in general, more speaking, which I think is interesting on the the language of crisis, which is typical Marxist, but also the way in which to look at different specificities of bodies and labor, which I think are super important category today to construct the narrative of how the everyday is really made in terms of productivity. So I found it very topical and also quite interesting. Silvia Federici is an interesting reader to a certain extent, beyond that being one of the last, probably as David Harvey Marxist, original Marxist to a certain extent, which has to belong to a very important connection of the overlapping within the feminism and the feminist core has to be connected with other forms of struggles globally, which I think is very interesting. Remember that Silvia Federici is based in the US, is part of a sort of original northern, if you want, reflection, which I do believe the expansion towards other forms of epistemologies grounded into the Marxist theory are still very, very important into the discussion. And we saw in other books the necessity or the strategies to go ahead. Again, I think the jump to disaster studies has to be done by work, and as you said, the work of love or the work of engaging with constant tradition. But still, the logic. The first chapter is very interesting. This counter planning. Remember and counter planning from the kitchen remembers very much bell hooks, but remember also Fred Moten and a sort of very important black literature or black critique. So what we have here is a sort of very interesting territory around which different forms of critique could find a fertile territory of engagement. Still the question remain on what constitutes today a class struggle, and for us today a class struggle is a question that probably has to be readdressed differently. And the question I have is how we reframe a class struggle today, originally into, and if the disaster studies somehow could connect with a class struggle. That for me remain a very open question.
I think this is super interesting. In class, that is something that certainly doesn't get picked up at all in disaster scholarship. But I want to bring Maha into the discussion, because what you said. Hi, Maha. Thank you so much for joining us. Hi. You've heard us kind of behind the scenes, right? Talking about this. The class struggle and kind of the crisis and the necessity to really move away from the Western epistemologies in a way that much of really Marxism is interpreted. And I as I was engaging with your work, in preparation to this live stream, and also Camilo was kind of telling me about the stuff that you do. It was all very, very exciting. And I wonder how do we actually talk about struggle? How do we talk about economic struggle, the kind of struggle for wage? How do we talk about exploitation and resistance in a context of crisis, and particularly in a context of Middle East and crisis, right? That we really somehow don't affiliate whatsoever or don't refer to whatsoever when we talk about Marxism in general.
Thank you. I want to reflect first on a few points that you were discussing, and I want to share a story. So my first experience as a young academic was, so I have a hobby of doing history on the side. And one of the things that we unpacked was we were looking at in Lebanon on the first martyred and the labor movement in Lebanon, because one of the first since the declaration of the state of Lebanon in 1943, we had lots of labor movements. This was one of the earliest things that we had. Marxism was very popular at that time. And then we started digging the archive of the Marxists at that time. And what I thought was fascinating is how much they intentionally try to silence all the women movement, which actually was the most prominent labor movement at that time. And one of the first people killed was a woman. So and it was so interesting that these Marxists themselves, and this is where I think the, patriarchy and Marxism and capitalism and all of these isms come together. And sometimes, you would think they should be on the same side, but often they don't. And that's where patriarchy is. I think it's interesting also to rethink of Marxism at least in Lebanon and the Middle East, and how much patriarchy dominated and shaped what can be done, who can be considered as resistance or not, or against the regime or not, etc. But also in the book, when you're discussing it, and unfortunately I didn't have the chance to read it, but there was another thing that was coming into my mind, is where does race sit into all of this? Because in Lebanon, the feminist movement, including a lot of the Marxists at that time, were not talking about race. They were not talking about female domestic workers in the feminist movement in Lebanon. And you would have lots of these middle class, upper class women demonstrating about the rights, but they were forgetting completely the rights of the domestic worker females in their houses. And this was not part of their issue. So I think it's all of these layers that come together is interesting. And I think add to that, when you have capitalism and when you have patriarchy, but also you have a religious system at the same time, the struggle to talk about women labor becomes even more difficult, because not only you have to fight patriarchy, you also have to fight these religious systems that are allying with the capital as well, because they are all in the end part of the same regime. They make up this regime that you're trying to penetrate and to break. And that I think is, that adds another layer of what challenge is. I mean, at least in Europe or in the global north, you don't have this. I mean, you do have it. Like in Poland, we still have, and in the US as well, we have issues around, women abortion, etc. But I think in the context of the Middle East, there's another layer. Religion becomes even a more prominent layer. But this, also I thought like how relevant this book is amid COVID. I think for all of us women, single moms or not single moms, we realized how much the world is still, unfair to women within a pandemic crisis. Women who are dying, the nurses are primarily females, ethnic minorities, etc., who are losing their lives, being underpaid, but also who had to do all the domestic work back at home. So I think this discussion is still very relevant. Now, in the context of disaster and crisis, and I'm going. So I was working on a presentation, and one of the things that I think is very interesting in the context of crisis and disasters is the tendency of now humanitarian regimes to stick to nation states as one of their strong frameworks to bring about anything that they want to do. It's easier for them to negotiate with a nation state, even if it's patriarchy, capitalist, unfair, etc. And they're okay to buy into all of this, exploitive system, and making refugees and displaced communities even more vulnerable. And I think this is, I wish we would have a debate like this with some humanitarian agencies around, around these topics and what systems they create to unfortunately strengthen these patriarchal systems that we have.
I really love the links that you're making between kind of borders and patriarchal systems. I haven't really thought about this in this way. We of course see it strengthening capitalist system, but as you said, right, everything kind of goes hand in hand. And I wonder how then the struggle that we're talking about, be that kind of the struggle from the left, right, the struggle from feminists, how that reflects the real struggle that the borders present to us, right? Because that, as you said, the struggles as they're portrayed now are very, very middle class, and of kind of very, very educated people, right? And not of the people who are marginalized and who are most affected by borders because they're invisible.
Yes, absolutely. And this is, I think, one of the issues that we continue to have. I mean, I think feminism has gone a long way to address class and it's a struggle, but still we have still a very long way, because I think it's very striking that we don't talk about race, we don't talk about that layer, we don't talk about legal status, and how this even adds another layer of exploitation, whether woman or not. There are many things that one could bring up here. I don't want to dominate the discussion, but
Go for it.
I think it's also one interesting, I think, class manifestation of how we talk about women's bodies, etc. is sex work. So in Lebanon, it was so interesting in the past 15 years. There had been a big push by international NGOs to stop using the word prostitute and talk about sex workers. While the studies in Lebanon were saying most of the women who are involved in prostitution or sex work, whatever you want to call it, are forced. So it's not a choice. So from a very Eurocentric point of view, they were free to use their bodies. But the women in their context, they say, we're not free to use our bodies, and it's not for us work, it's an exploitation. And there was a lot of tensions between feminist groups at that time. It's like, no, we cannot talk about sex work. And it is exploitation, and it is, and this is a class issue, and this is also, there's a cultural dimension to what is considered to be okay or not okay, or what would women internalize or not internalize. And I think this is an interesting class issue as well, but also very Western-centric understanding of bodies and sexuality.
This is very interesting. Maybe I can come with one question. There is at one. I love that reflection. One of the limits I think that the book is offering is somehow, of course, a deliberate Western critique, as you said. So set into the limit. But there is one sentence that I think is interesting into the logic is. Which is both Marxist and also the interpretation of Silvia Federici, which is that the revolution starts at home, and is a sentence that is quite provocative on one side, but also very interesting. And homes means different things, especially in a context where the neoliberal drive of a certain urban planning dimensions was, privatizing home, the absence of a social state or a complex state too. But on the other, the struggle to make home, the struggle to, construct the domesticity, the possibility of living, and an interrelated, financial crisis that now is in Lebanon very, very intense into that. And I wonder what would be your reaction, your reading of this question? The revolution starts at home. It's which in Federici is a sort of very positive call, which is like to repossess the locality, the home, the intimacy, the domestic labor, and the reproduction, which is canonical feminism. But what would be that possibility in a context like Lebanon, where making home is a continuous struggle?
Okay, I think this again comes to the individualistic versus a more structural challenge, and I think there is a tendency for us to put a lot on the individual. And I think in my part of the world, community matters more. And I think, and it's interesting how the West then looks at what happens, women's movement. Like, let's say Iran, what's happening now. I mean, this is a revolution at home, if you take it as an example. But at the same time, and it's saluted, but at the same time, the sanctions that have been imposed on Iran, the impact on women and all their lives has never been questioned. And I think this is why both, and this is why also we see notions such as resilience, again, putting the responsibility on the individual, while we're kind of like ruining the lives of, and creating a system that can ruin their life. And I think this is where we need to be very cautious about how much we give responsibility. It's a very heavy burden to give this. I agree in some sense, yes, to some extent, and maybe I think it's a generational change that would probably it's a long-term change rather than a short-term. But I think um, structure is super important. I think leaving it all to the individual and the home is a huge endeavor. I think it still happens. I'm not saying it doesn't. It does, but I don't think that we should leave it all to the home.
Thank you.
That's really interesting. Jason, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it's we've talked about this before in the podcast and written about the way that neoliberalism kind of suggests that you solve systemic issues or systemic oppression and violence with individual protective measures. And that's a big critique of the resilience paradigm. And yeah, one thing that came to mind when you were talking, Maha, about like liberation, sexual liberation, was in one thing that stuck out to me from this book was the way that she argued for liberation from sex, as a role that was like expected. So that she was arguing for liberation from sex rather than further exploitation by intensification of the expectation of sex. And I think that was an important direction that she was taking in this book. And certainly something to think about, because a lot of feminism is driving towards intensification of sexuality, and it just made me think for sure.
Absolutely, I think it's interesting coming myself from a traditional background, I would say, where I remember as a young person, it's like it's a religious duty, particularly in marriage. Sex is a religious duty, and if you're not doing it, then the angels are cursing you all day and night. And it's interesting that now, 20 years later, we're talking about family rape, even in Lebanon, and for rape within marriage. That was something that you would not talk about. So I think we have gone a long way, but at the same time, we have gone in some areas. We have also gone into other ways, and I think this is what women are also complaining about: is the over sexualization and the over expectations of what you need to be doing. I don't know if you've during some. I think in a couple of years ago there was a Women's Day, and one of the videos that was shared widely was about how women are expected to be pretty, productive, sexy, working, clever, smart, and cook and do all of this. And in some ways, you've acquired. Me and my friends from the Middle East often talk about how we feel cheated because now we're expected to work outside and to work inside. So you have double the workload. And when it comes to laws and legislations, you don't have any rights that are protected. Particularly in Lebanon, we still have religious family law. So inheritance. Divorce laws are all very patriarchal and very much still religious and very much pro-men. So this is where, you feel like we have caught on with the women's movement, like work, freedom, independence, but at the same time, we haven't gained our rights, the legal rights on the other side, if we ever want to challenge this. And this is what I think fighting from home and liberation from home becomes even harder. And Lebanon, despite all I mean, at the moment, there are very strong campaigns by women concerning children custody. And still, some of the courts have improved the child custody age, but still you can lose your child when they turn 2 and you would hardly see them. So again, this is where we feel like we've made achievement in certain ways, but I think the toughest battle is the religious battle.
One thing that I think about is, as you're speaking there, Maz, that it seems like a lot of the social change that is like required or like where progress is made, women are being expected to do more. And like the expectation is like, how are women going to change their role or behavior or whatnot, rather than thinking about who else needs to change in this situation, you know? Not only is it systemic, but it's also very much on men who benefit from the way that the system is and the fact that they are not expected to do domestic work. Like, we don't talk enough about how that behavior and how that role needs to change, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. I just want to touch on one theme that I would love to share with you, because especially that we talk about disasters and in a context of conflict, because one of the themes that is very much close to or what a humanitarian organization would think there's more of a feminist way, or more like sympathizers and trying to put women is the concept of vulnerability. So women are always considered more vulnerable, and as a result, a higher, they have to be protected more. And I think this post for me is like, can we really say that women are more vulnerable in context of, let's say, displacement or not? Because men can be extremely vulnerable in the sense of they could be killed, shot, or kidnapped, or etc. So, and it was interesting to see how this concept of vulnerability has gained a lot of legal structure, particularly in the global north, and it's a criteria for asylum seeking, which is somehow, I was just thinking, like, should women be seen as more vulnerable than men or not? Or, does that mean that their lives more valued than others? And that is interesting, because when we're doing a study on that, men were telling, in some ways they were extremely vulnerable. So yes, I was just curious to what are your thoughts on this?
Go, Jason.
No, you're picking up on something that's
this.
quite dear to us, and we've been writing. We have a paper almost ready to submit. That's really kind of reframing vulnerability. We draw on a lot of feminist critique of vulnerability, how it's been used. Disaster anthropology, I think, has done a better job than a lot of disaster studies in looking at vulnerability in a critical way. But you're right. It's almost like we need to refocus what we're trying to say about women's identity and characteristics and towards oppression and violence, rather than like vulnerability as something that should be pitied or is a weakness or something. But I think if we talk about it more in terms of oppression and violence, then it becomes a much more critical conversation that cannot be solved through like some sort of standard approach to like of pity or of humanitarian aid. It becomes a much more useful discussion when we talk of it in those terms.
And I guess this has kind of been a thread through the whole of the season, right? In the live streams and in our readings, and it's fascinating to see how, no matter which almost which side we approach kind of disasters from, right, we always come back to this kind of this discussion and challenging of the notions of vulnerability, of the notions of kind of understanding struggle and resistance. So it's been great to see. And I guess it has reinforced our point of reading outside of the disciplines, right? And not just kind of getting stuck with disaster-focused literature. And I'm mindful of time, and I really don't want Camilo to miss the flight. That'll be quite funny, right? But
I'm just waiting to see him.
For a good conversation, I'm happy to lose.
You're willing to miss the flight. Okay, that's the commitment.
I'm devoted to the code. Let me say something about this. This about the vulnerability, which I think is interesting. I think the whole apparatus of critique that we have sort of alluding and reflecting through is actually really pointing to the capacity to unpack complex concepts that are not any more useful to depict the situation. And one of the things that I think is important, especially in rereading Silvia Federici's, is the fact that the concept of vulnerability has to be rethought relationally. as a forms of production, not as
Absolutely.
something given, right? And I think that is super important, and can be reconnected back to what Maha was saying, and just not. And if we were to students that immediately approach to disaster studies or so, is actually to question the relationality of the factor of vulnerability, and actually. Feminist theory and feminist critical theory was absolutely immediately spot on into that,
Mm.
and immediately saying, "Oh, why we should, why we have, why we are." And I think that is super important. And this doesn't mean to to question the complete history, but to a certain extent, I think there is another problem which I think is critical enough, is a critique on the fact that in the original reading of Marx, which is outdated, originally outdated in terms of, but outdated in the sense that belongs to a very moment of history, is that emancipation starts from work, which I think is a super important element for humanitarian agencies too. Is the centrality of work to, I mean, if you have to rephrase Marxist reflection, which is, the emancipation starts from industrialization. Of course, industrialization was basic that moment of logic of work in Europe when Marx was writing, right? But in reality, it's the work. So it's the capacity to produce meaningful life, and to sustain life of that. And I think that is super important, because that's opened the question to the informal capacity of generating wage, the informal network of doing, and the capacity of the state actually to employ somehow. I think that is a very important element to go back to in humanitarian regimes, that is certainly, which is not good for work or other forms of solidarity or that, but is the fact of thinking that people, in order to achieve dignity and liberation, is actually to be productive, to find the pathway to liberation through schools or through emancipation, to being able to share capacity, skills, and component. And I think that logic, both pedagogically speaking but also economically speaking, is super important to be rethought into the humanitarian regime, which I believe is part of the conversation we are having.
So, Camilo, you would replace the revolution happens at home. It happens at work, then, in your opinion?
Well, someone has already said that, but yes, I think it's interesting to yeah.
I think it connects to,
Go.
I was just going to say, I think it connects to Freire, what we were talking about, and to like changing the world, changing your reality. And maybe it goes in a certain direction if we talk about like labor struggle and workplaces, but when we think of it more broadly as like changing our material conditions through acting on the world and acting on the problems that we see, I think it connects to that kind of theory as well.
Yeah, but also in acting in a way that emphasizes dignity rather than productivity, right? And kind of rather than the wage. And I think that's really important. Thank you so much. Thank you, Camilo, for being with us through the season. It's just been wonderful to have you as our co-curator. We absolutely love chatting with you, and it's been great. And Maha, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights. It's great, and I hope we can continue this conversation. I have 100 more million questions for you. And before we finish, I also want to thank all of our audience, right, for reading together with us in this season. I really loved exploring what kind of critical theory means through all these various readings. And I hope we have convinced you of the importance of praxis and reflection, right, and reading outside of our disciplines. And we hope that you enjoyed this live stream format. And also, as Jason said, the audio versions of all the live streams will be released soon. And in fact, you can already catch up with the first 2 episodes, and the wrap-up episode will be coming out in audio format only in a couple of weeks' time. We will be back with season 8 in early January 2023. And we will be back to our normal audio format But of course, we don't want you to miss us too much, right? So please join us for a special live stream on the 28th of November, where we will be joined by our friend Jay Kadag to discuss the virtual special issue of Decolonizing Disasters in Disaster Journal that Jake guest edited last year. And then we will, of course, do a Christmas special. I know everybody loves Christmas special, but it's too early to talk about that. It's not even November yet. So thank you for joining us. Follow us on Twitter and on any podcast app. And of course, enjoy the rest of season 7. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Alex.
Camille. Bye.